Thank you so much, Gloria. Really appreciate that presentation. From here, we're just going to move into kind of a discussion panel session. We're going to try to answer several of the questions that have come in on the chat. But now as we transition, everyone is welcome to include additional questions for us to consider. If you do have a question that should be directed to a specific person or a specific project, if you could list that in the question, that would be really helpful. And I just want to invite all of our presenters to join by camera now, if possible. Great. Thanks. All right. So we've had a number of questions come in. Again, please continue to send those in on the chats. Maybe we'll just start with a couple of directed questions to specific people and projects. So for the first one, I'd like to direct to Scott. So some people had some questions about the air quality model and how often that is run and how often your map updates. Could you answer those questions?
Sure, yeah. So the model is run by NOAA. It's run twice daily for 48 hours. They're about to extend it to a 72-hour forecast. And our map updates hourly, about 20 minutes past the hour that the data was collected.
Great. Also for your project, they noted that low-cost monitors are hosted by locals. Is there funding made available for local people to host, maintain, or participate in your project?
Yeah, so we don't provide funding directly. However, we have a lot of projects and programs where that involves siting purple air sensors. So essentially, we will install them for free at homes, assuming that they meet the criteria for the programs and projects.
So this is actually a question that many people could answer, but since both your project, Scott, and the fire and smoke map use purple air sensors and mention that specifically, let's make sure that everyone's on the same page. Do the inexpensive purple air sensors really produce data that compares well with the more conventional monitors?
Yeah, I mean, that's that's a tough question. It really, the question is, does it compare well enough for the application at hand? And we think it does. I mean, we wouldn't use it for determining attainment of the Clean Air Act, and air quality standards, but we think that once they're calibrated and properly QA/QC'd, they compare pretty well with the regulatory monitors and good enough to be able to make decisions about how to minimize exposure.
Great. Would the fire and smoke team like to add anything to
that? Sim, I think you're on mute there.
Carolyn, do you want to answer that, or otherwise I can step in? But so I think that Scott's answer is exactly right. The question is, if you had your choice and the budget, etc., you would obviously pick the the higher cost sensors to place, and you would use those everywhere. But there are so many things that those sensor networks just don't provide you. And so what we're trying to do in these hybrid systems, I think, is take the best of both worlds. We're trying to take those more regulatory type, higher instrumentation measurements where we can get them, and then we're trying to spatially distribute the plume or the impact zone using the low-cost sensor where we don't have that other information. And so when you ask the question, are they good enough? I think they are good enough for that purpose. Again, you wouldn't use them, as Scott said, for regulatory purpose, but they do add quite a large amount of value in this just sort of spatializing of the impact zone. And that seems to have be worthwhile, right? So that's, but, you know, from our perspective, the reason why it's a pilot project and the reason why we're doing all this work is exactly to try and answer that question. Like, let's put this out, let's see how it works, let's see how it works over time, and then judge what can be done, you know, further with that. So that's why we have the pilot project.
So maybe another question for you. There's some interest in maybe using sensors to detect the start of wildfires. Can you talk a little bit about that application?
Sure. So I think that, you know, there's a lot of interest within the fire community about using automated systems of various types to detect the start of wildfires. Those are generally not air quality measurements because, you know, an air quality impact is generally related to a more well-developed plume. And we're really hoping to catch those fires at an earlier stage when they're not generating lots of air quality impacts. So, you know, lots of systems come into play, including, you know, automated cameras on lookout towers, you know, use of automated lightning strike detects, use of satellite data, you know, just a whole bunch of things can come into play, but typically not air quality things.
Great. So let's switch to Caroline. Caroline, one of the questions is about the correction equation. Actually, there are several questions about that. But can you talk a little bit about when it's applicable, like just for fires or for more ambient?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when we built the original correction factor, which is a linear correction with a relative humidity term, we built it based on a data set of 24-hour averaged co-located purple air sensors with air monitoring stations across the country. And so most of that data was typical ambient, not impacted by smoke impacts. Most of it was, you know, under 30 micrograms per meter cubed. And so we actually, you know, tested it on an independent data set from Amra Holder's paper, which was from smoke impacted times. And we found it worked pretty well there as well, up to 250 micrograms. So it's really a pretty good correction for both your typical ambient and your smoke impacts, at least in the US. And so we are working on that higher concentration correction, which we will take into account the same thing, trying to make sure we have a correction that works both for typical ambient and also smoke impact.
Great. And you just mentioned that while you were generating the correction equation, you used 24-hour average data. And can you talk a little bit about how it's being applied on the smoke and fire map, kind of different averaging and why that could not be appropriate, how you tested that?
Yes. So originally we had built based on 24-hour averages, so we could use the data from the federal reference method, which is 24-hour average filter-based data, in addition to the federal equivalent methods, which are at the higher time resolutions. And so when we tested that on the 1 hour data, it seemed appropriate. And we also are showing the 1 hour data on the fire and smoke map, in addition to the now casted data, which is a little bit longer average, 12-hour weighted average, more like a 3 hour average often. And so it seems like it's appropriate to look at the 1 hour data. There is still some noise in both the sensor and the federal equivalent methods or the temporary smoke measurements at those kind of averages. But we know that people want to see at least hour averages to understand what's going on outside.
Great. And could you talk very briefly about why RH is included in the correction?
Yes, so plant tower sensors and purple air sensors, these are measuring the light scattering of particles. And so when our federal reference and federal equivalent methods, those are based on dried PM. And so you're either drying it, the PM in a lab, or you're drying it before you're taking a real-time measurement. And so when you're looking at light scattering without drying, there's more water condensed on the particles, and so it's scattering more light. And so that's why we're taking into account humidity, is because it looks like, you know, the sensors read a little bit higher when it's more humid in a lot of the locations we looked at.
Great. So now we'll move on to some questions for IQ Air. So there's some interest in how localized the IQ Air forecasts are. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I can answer that question. So Regarding this localization of the IQR forecast, so overall we have, it really depends on the location. So we have, for example, in low populated areas, we have a 10 by 10 kilometer forecast, and also air quality data, real-time air quality data. And for cities where we have actually a lot more sensors, we go down to a resolution of 1 kilometer, 1 by 1 kilometer in terms of air quality forecast, and even at 100 meters in some of the cities. So for example, if you check on our map, you can zoom on a city like Bangkok, where we have deployed over 1,000 sensors, which actually makes Bangkok one of the most, I would say, sensed city in the world for air quality. Then we go down to like a roughly 100 to 200 meters resolution in terms of air quality data. So again, the answer is it depends on how populated is the areas.
Great. And we have some questions about what type of machine learning algorithms you're using and for what purposes.
Okay, so we get really lots of data. As Glory mentioned during the presentation, we actually get data from 5 different types of low-cost sensors, Purple Air being one of those low-cost sensors. But again, we don't just focus on the US, like for example, SIM Caroline, we're like talking about on source code. So this is really from a world approach. So we are feeding all this low-cost sensor data as an input. We also have fire data, satellite data. So we put all these data points that we process on an hourly basis. So we roughly process about 10 billion data points per hour. So that's really a lot of data. And we just, one of the biggest challenge in processing that data is actually to get rid of the outliers, to be able to clean as much as possible that data nearly in real time. And that's why we actually apply machine learning for 2 different things. One of them is first is to validate and calibrate the low-cost, or well, let's say validate sensors, whether they are reference sensors or low-cost sensors, and then calibrate those low-cost sensors. Because I think Caroline was mentioning about this one, the calibration of low-cost sensors, whether they are plant tower sensors or IQS sensors, they will behave very differently. Some will be very, let's say, sensitive to humidity, as plant tower sensors are. Some others much less. Some won't see, for example, PM10 in sandstorms. Probably that's not too much of a US concern, the sandstorms, but in some part of the world, like the Middle East or in some part of Central Asia, that's quite a big concern. So you need to be able to calibrate these data points so that they actually become meaningful. So that's one of the things. First usage of machine learning is for data validation and calibration. The second one is also used for forecasting. So for cities where we have lots of historical data, as well as let's say good granularity of sensors, then we're able to actually forecast quite accurately in those cities. So that's the second usage of machine learning in the IQR platform.
Great. And your platform, since it ingests several different types of sensor data, I imagine that data has various characteristics. Like some might be reporting raw data, whereas others have been corrected on board or in the cloud in some way. And then you might need to apply some sort of correction machine learning on top of that. How does your process vary based on these types of process levels?
Yeah, so usually we would, first of all, we would not, we would just validate government sensors. Just to answer also one of the questions that was going on there, government sensors do need to be validated in many places. I think the US EPA is doing a pretty good job at the QA for reference sensors, but some other countries around the world are kind of publishing what we would call raw data without this check. And that can be a major influence on people, especially when we have lots of app users in a city. And if suddenly we need to send a notification to, let's say, 100,000 people that there's a bad air quality, but it's a faulty government sensor, that can be quite a big issue in creating panic in a city. So that's why data validation is key for that. For low-cost sensors, then that's where this calibration comes into play to ensure the relevance of the data. So again, the more low-cost sensors you have, the more precise is your overall network, and the more accurate you can deliver data to people.
Great. So this is more of a question to everyone. What is the most common public misperception about evaluating air quality data? And how has the product that you've created helped to alleviate some of that confusion or address the misconceptions? Could we start with Scott?
Thanks. Yeah. So in my sense, we answer a lot of calls from the public in my group, hundreds a year and emails. And I think the most common public misconception is what the colors mean on the AQI scale. So often people see orange, which is unfortunately very common in our area. That's unhealthy for sensitive groups. And they think that it's the air apocalypse. They want to keep their kids home from school or never even leave the house. But in reality, when you look at the guidance for orange or for unhealthy for sensitive groups, it says that sensitive populations should avoid prolonged or heavy outdoor exertion. So we really try to, but the color doesn't really indicate that. So we really try to make the guidance for each AQI category very visible, so that you don't just see a color without some link to the guidance right below it. And we've actually cut down on these calls pretty significantly since then.
So fire and smoke?
I guess I can go first. From my perspective, I think Scott's answer is a great one, but to add to that, I'd say what time scale the color or number that they're viewing on a map actually represents. So people have this sense that they want to be able to go outside and experience something and have that sort of that immediacy of their personal experience reflected back to them on the map. And smoke can be very variable. So you can have sort of things that waft in and out. You can also have people have pretty different reactions to smoke depending on their own, personal health, et cetera. And so, and then typically when we're trying to show something, we're trying to show it in this slightly longer time scale of the nowcast AQI and present that color back to them as kind of a health metric, a behavioral metric that they can do something with. And that disconnect can be frustrating to people. So, if something happens very rapidly, they want to see that immediately evaluated. Now, you can do that more of that with low-cost sensors, but it's also a little bit unclear how much you should completely alter your behavior or your plans for the day just based off of the last 10 minutes, say. So that's a tension that we deal with a lot, and one that I think is partially a process of learning and partially a process of trying to figure out how to show data and explain things in a way that people will understand what it is they're looking at.
I definitely agree with what Sim said, and understanding what is actually the implication of some of these short-term high concentration events is really important sometimes to look at the longer term trends. And also understanding, no measurement is 100% confident, even though we're trying to do a lot of quality assurance on the map and things like that. Sometimes things do come through. Occasionally somebody takes their sensor indoors and we don't catch it. And so, always just having a little bit of skepticism, I think is good to keep thinking about it.
If I can just follow that up one more second, Andrea. I also think that there's a lot of spatial variability in smoke, particularly if there's any topography or something like that involved. So, if your house is slightly more elevated than where the sensor is or something, you can be in a different kind of situation. And so even though the sensor is fairly close to you and you feel like it should be representing you, it's really representing conditions where the sensor is, or not where you happen to be at the moment. And we're sort of trying to do the best we can to reflect that overall, but it's imperfect.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, Maybe I can speak a few things more from a global perspective, and then Glory may add some more related to the US market. We monitor and publish air quality data in basically almost any country in the world. So we had a big challenge because some countries use a different AQI. So once you come with, let's say, the US AQI, there's really a difference. Some countries may actually be more stringent than the US AQI, but most of them are not. So we are not comparing oranges with apple. So in quite a number of cases, we had some controversies, like in Korea, in Vietnam and other places where we were showing different data from the government. So we have chosen to go for the US AQI because I think we love the scale. It's quite clear to understand. There's also a lot of research that has been put behind that. So thank you for US EPA colleagues for this one. We decided to go, however, for something slightly different. We were thinking about using Nowcast, but actually what really people do want is the real-time AQI. So that they're actually checking right now, can I go outside and run? Or should I stay indoor because of the smoke from the wildfires? While the US AQI, which is based on 24 hours average, is not really relevant. If I'm in the middle of a sandstorm, I should really stay home right now. The 24 average will not be helpful for this kind of cases. So we decided to actually apply this real-time AQI by saying that if you stay under this kind of exposure for 24 hours, you would have an unhealthy air quality. So that's how we've approached this one. The second also very important thing is throwing out a number and maybe some health recommendation. I mean, it requires some mental effort, but that's why we actually worked quite a lot with graphics. And I don't know if you've used our app, but you see there's a guy with a mask, and the size of the mask actually varies based on how heavy is the pollution. And I think that really speaks to not just to adults, but also to kids, for them to really understand what they need to do, they need to protect themselves. So I think that's what's very important, is not just to throw out a number, but also explain this behind and try to educate through, for example, graphical designs to make this air data more speaking for itself. Glory, you want to add something?
Sure. That's really the big difference is how can we truly provide real-time air quality data that's as quickly as possible, but also at the same time balancing that between reliability and accuracy. So this is really something that we think a lot about because for our customers, for our users, they want really truly real-time data. There was a question about what do we mean about whether or not we have to validate government equipment. And the question is, it's not about calibrating government equipment. It's just about, do we publish the government data, yes or no? So that was a question that someone asked there.
I think also on the communication of air quality, something we found very interesting is to provide context to the information, not just a number. But for example, you can have a look at Thailand right now on our global map. You can zoom in, go in the northern Thailand. You'll see fires everywhere. It's like really pretty impressive. That's data from the NASA, by the way. Thank you for NASA to provide this data. And that provides context because you see the winds, you see all those fires happening, and you understand why. There is like, I think, an AQI of above 200 right now in northern Thailand. So providing context, where is the smoke going with the winds? Are there any fires around it? It really helps people to digest that information.
Great. So I know we're a little bit over time already. I do want to hit maybe just a couple of more questions. So if you're willing to hang on with us for just a little bit longer, we'll try to kind of move into the future focus type of questions. So I would just like to ask each of our presenting groups what they anticipate being the next steps for the products that they've created, both in the short term and in the long term. So maybe we can start with the smoke and fire map this time.
Sure. I think that there are a couple of different categories for this. I'll let Caroline speak to the changes to actual correction of the low-cost sensor data. Overall, for the fire and smoke map, there's been a significant amount of sort of development work in preparation for the 2021 fire season that we're hoping to roll out later this year. The goals of that are to try and, bring the information more into context. So we think we have a good start, but there's obviously things we learned from last year, and we're trying to, present, like what IQ Air was saying, when you see a color, and I think Scott said it, but when you see a color, present the protective actions right there, and provide that sort of linkage more directly. There are some additional ways to look at how we might utilize the low-cost sensor data to examine things like how, what's the trend beyond the nowcast. And so we're hoping to have ways to display that kind of information. That's all in development and in discussion. So, specifics on what will come out, but we do think that the interface will be significantly revamped. And Carolyn, if you want to talk about how the correction factors might be.
Yeah, so we'll plan to update the correction factor to hit some of that very high concentration data that we unfortunately saw last year. And we're coming up on trying to get everything wrapped up in just a couple months before the next fire season really hits. Hopefully not as hard as last year. And then we'll see, in future years, if we're able to expand in any other ways.
Great. IQ Air?
Yes, I see two next steps for example, the platform we are developing, but overall for the industry. I think the first one is that users or the public is really interested in real-time air quality data. I think that's kind of the comment we got from everyone here. So that's really a big trend to have real-time. We're talking probably of a granularity of, I would say, 5 to 10 minutes to be really relevant. Definitely not the average of the past hour. That's just too late for many cases. And the other big thing I think that we are seeing is to have a higher density of sensors deployed. And that's not going to happen with reference government monitors, just too expensive. So I think this year and next year we'll see a major amount of low-cost sensors deployed, and that will also come with a huge amount of data to process. But I think at least it seems like all our free organizations in these calls are pretty much up to the task to handle that amount of data, as long as we make good use of that and provide helpful information to users.
And just piggybacking on that, what's coming up, we have just with regards to our map and applications, we've got a lot of new features that we'll be bringing out actually in the next 4 to 6 weeks. We're going with a very high resolution. That's one of the features that we've been working on for a couple of months now. So that we'll be bringing out soon, and also working with community groups locally. These community groups are actually setting up air quality monitoring networks and maintaining those networks, and those are with low-cost sensors.
And Scott?
Yeah, so when we built our platform and started displaying the map, we were kind of limited as to where the existing sensors were. But now that we have this platform, we're working really closely with our AQ Spec team, which is Air Quality Sensor Performance Evaluation Center, to help fill holes in the map. So we're deploying additional purple air sensors. They also do a lot of evaluations of new other sensor types besides purple air. And we're deploying AQY sensors, which also measure ozone and NO2 and PM2.5. But we need to do a little bit of infrastructure development on the coding side to get those integrated and figure out how we're going to calibrate or QA/QC. So we're working closely with them and kind of trying to fill all these holes in the map, the existing holes in the map, with new sensors. And by the way, they have a lot of information on siting criteria, siting guidance, to help people. If you want to buy your own sensor, you can go to their website by searching AQ Spec, AQMD. on Google and get some additional information about how well that sensor performs and how to site it properly.
Great. And maybe the last question for today, what advice do each of you have for other organizations, whether that be like a community group or maybe another state or local air quality agency? What advice do you have if they want to start similar efforts to the ones we've discussed today? What would you say? Scott, could we start with you?
Sure, yeah. So my best advice, I think the thing that made our project successful was that we involved the public very early on. So we essentially distilled out all of the common misconceptions and questions that we get from the public on a regular basis and designed our product to specifically answer those questions. And then we kept a group of like very enthusiastic members of the public involved throughout the whole process. So they were able to test the products before it was deployed to the public. And we really considered what they had to say to make sure that our final products avoid these common misconceptions. That's been really fruitful for us.
Great advice. IQ Air?
Yeah, I think for communities, we have quite some experience working with them. I was mentioning Bangkok, where we have over 1,000 individuals or communities that have deployed sensors there. So I think what they need to know is it's really not difficult. First of all, the technology is there. You have quite a few good sensors available. I think AQMD is doing a good job there at testing those sensors. So the technology is there. I would say also the data processing of those sensors is there as well. So I think it's a great chance to get started now in deploying sensors.
Fire and smoke.
I like those answers. I guess I'll say that if you want to start creating maps and showing your data, one of the things that we've explicitly done in our development is try and create a reusable map. And so we've actually started working with other organizations like the state smoke blogs, et cetera, in the US to try and embed versions of the same map, the same code base into those so that as development proceeds, it can sort of benefit multiple areas, and also so that there's a more unified display between different sites. So anybody who's interested in that, please, contact me. Happy to discuss that with you. Yeah.
And I would just add to what everyone else has said, just, keep checking your map or whatever your data source is, because, there's so many things that just change or come up unexpectedly, like some of the extremely high concentrations we experienced, or just other, kind of data processing issues that we weren't aware of that either we found ourselves or people brought to our attention, and just continuing looking for ways to improve.
Great advice. Thank you, everyone, so much. So I know that we've already run over time a bit, but we do want to wrap up here before the half hour. So I just want to thank all of our panelists and participants here today. Panelists, you did a great job explaining your work and answering all these great questions. And everyone who was in the audience, we got tons of questions. We really appreciate all of that. We're going to try to respond to a lot of them in writing. So Sandra actually said that hopefully by around Monday of next week, the recording from today will be available on the ASIC website. And we'll be working to answer many of these audience questions and posting them there as well. Of course, many of the presenters also gave you information so you can contact them directly, should that be better for you. So I just want to thank everyone again for your time and effort, and especially the Air Quality Research Center for hosting this webinar. And we hope to see you all again for our next webinar in about a month. Thank you.